Now the northern countries, which were in their isles, were quivering in their bodies. They penetrated the channels of the Nile's mouth. Their nostrils have ceased to function, so that their desire is to breathe the breath. His Majesty has gone forth like a whirlwind against them, fighting on the battlefield like a runner. The dread of him and the terror of him have entered their bodies. They are capsized and overwhelmed in their places. Their hearts are taken away. Their soul is flown away. Their weapons are scattered to the sea. His arrow pierces him whom he has wished among them, while the fugitive becomes one fallen into the water. His Majesty is like an enraged lion, attacking his assailant with his pawns, plundering on his right hand and powerful on his left hand, like Seth destroying the serpent, evil of character. This is the Medinet Habu inscription. It's the story of a battle between Ramses III, Pharaoh of Egypt, and a mysterious group of foreign invaders that history remembers as the Sea Peoples. And it comes with this rather fancy cartoon, which depicts the pharaoh, Ramses himself, apparently 50 foot tall, facing off with his army against a fearsome and fairly diverse bunch of people in boats. In my last video, I talked about the Bronze Age collapse, and how in this shockingly small span of time, almost all of the states of the Near East fell apart. Which is why this inscription is so important, because the battle that it talks about happened between 1178 and 1175, which means it's right in the middle of our timeline for the Bronze Age collapse. This obviously suggests that whoever these Sea People were, they probably had something to do with the collapse. So, does the inscription have any clues in it as to who they might have been, where they originated from, and how they might have contributed? Well, yes it does. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up at Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward towards Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Palaset, Tajeka, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Washesh lands united. They laid their hands upon the land as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting. Our plans will succeed. Well, if that doesn't convince the jury, I don't know what will. Honestly, I feel like a bit of a tit after the last video, making this big deal out of the mystery of the Bronze Age. Ooh, why did these civilizations fail? Ramses has gone and answered that question for us. Evidently, the Sea People rocked up, burned everything in their wake from north to south, and destroyed all these great empires and their trade system. Well, nice. Glad we sorted that out. Except, obviously, it's not that easy. On the surface level, yes, the Sea People seem to be the obvious culprits, but the closer you look, the more uncertain their role in this story really becomes. Who were they, and where did they come from? Why did they set sail on this path of destruction? Why were they successful? Why could nobody stop them? And why is it that after burning all this land in Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant, did they not settle there and instead continue to move south towards Egypt? So we'll start with where they might have come from. This is broadly divided into two schools of thought. Those who thought they came from outside of the Bronze Age world, away from the influence of the great states of the time, and this trade network they had set up, and those who think they came from within it. We'll start with the former, and to do that we have to talk about migrations. Human beings moving around and migrating has always affected the course of history. The westward migration of the Huns certainly contributed to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Norse rocking up on the shores of the British Isles and deciding they'd like to stay certainly shook things here up a little bit. And, well, just ask a Native American how much a large band of strangers just appearing out of the blue on your shores can really fuck your day up. When it comes to trying to figure out the origins of the Sea People, it's mostly their names and their dress that we have to go off of. So the Sherden, or the Shardana, are usually etymologically linked with Sardinia. The Pelaset and the Denyen, this is often considered just the Egyptian way of saying Pelasgian or Danaan, which usually refers to the people of the Aegean. When we look at the way that some of them are dressed, we see the horned helmets, we see these round studded shields, small pointy beards, and Mediterranean kilts. A dress style that very much resembles the Nugaric people who inhabited Corsica, Sardinia, and the Western Mediterranean. But the first real migrations hypothesis for these people came from the same place as many problematic historical theories: 19th century France. This is Gaston Maspero. He was an Egyptologist who didn't really know much about the scale of the Bronze Age collapse, but was very interested in identifying the origins of the people who rocked up in the late New Kingdom. Maspero originally really bought into the idea that the Sea Peoples came to Egypt from the islands of the Western Mediterranean, but he didn't think they originated there. He thought that they were an Indo-European tribe who came from the Balkans before being driven out by migrating Illyrians who then came and settled the area. They then go on this huge great trek across Europe, down into North Africa, eventually landing in Libya, where they would then attack Egypt from. At the time, this was a very, very popular theory, although it quickly became viewed, quite rightfully, as deeply flawed. Maspero describes the Libyans of this era as men of tall stature, large of limb, fair of skin, light of hair, and blue of eyes. So that's obviously nonsense. The Libyans of this era don't appear to have been the whitest of white people, and funnily enough, no archaeological evidence has appeared suggesting that there was some great trek of Indo-Europeans from Central Europe all the way down to Africa and then into Egypt. Nevertheless, Maspero was highly influential on the study of the era, and even though mainstream history has rightfully dropped many of his theories, a lot of them still hold up. The Shurden, or Shadana, almost certainly did originate in the islands of the Western Mediterranean, and at least a portion of the Sea Peoples do seem to have come from outside of the Bronze Age world and migrated in. But even if some of the Sea Peoples did in fact originate from outside of the Bronze Age world, by the time they attack Egypt in the reign of Ramses III, their ranks are almost certainly being supplemented by those from within the Bronze Age world. As we've already discussed, the Denyen are quite possibly the Danans, Homer's Achaeans, and the Peliset, probably the Pelagasians from Asia Minor and the Aegean. But there's one other group not mentioned by Ramses, but who do appear in other accounts of the Sea People, whose location we can be fairly sure of. These are the Luca people from the land of Luca in southern Anatolia. We know this because it's probably linked to the later name for the area, Lysia. It's possible that these lands were the first ones to be attacked by the Sea People, and after their kingdoms are desolated, the victims join the party. And by time this horde of now mixed piratical raider, refugee, invader groups, by the time they reach Egypt, their ranks are swelled with the numbers that they picked up along the way. Or it's possible that the majority of Sea People had always originated from within the Bronze Age world, from peripheral kingdoms that were kind of hanging off the edge of the large empires. Shortly after Maspero had drawn attention to this field of study, a German historian called Edward Mayer put forth a theory that the Sea Peoples had been mercenaries from the periphery of the Bronze Age world. And during the wars between the great states, they'd been hired out and had supplemented the military, slowly becoming more important to it, until eventually times got hard, these great states couldn't pay their mercenaries anymore, and, well, we all know what happens when you can't pay your mercenaries. He compares the relationship that people like the Tajeka and the Shurden might have had with the Egyptian and Hittite empires to what people like the Goths might have had with the Roman Empire, where they were originally federates and largely hired mercenaries. And this all went very, very well until hard times hit the Roman Empire and they couldn't pay their mercenaries and they mistreated these people, had always acted superior to them, and eventually it would be these peripheral people who would pounce on them when they're weak and tear their world apart. But look, we could spend all day discussing the potential origins of the Sea People and poking fun at weird old historians. But there are far, far better videos on YouTube that discuss where the Sea People might have come from and who they might have been. We're more interested in their potential role in the collapse. And for that, we need evidence. If the Sea Peoples are on trial for the murder of the Bronze Age, things don't really look good for them. They're present at the scene of the crime, and the testimony of Ramses III certainly doesn't paint them in a good light, but we still don't have enough to convict. So, what do we have by way of evidence? Well, we have two Egyptian inscriptions, the one that we're already familiar with, the Medinet Habu one by Ramses III, and one from about 30 years earlier during the reign of the pharaoh Meneptah. Much like with the inscription of Ramses, Meneptah describes a coalition of people, some of which have some fairly familiar names, being led into Egypt by a Libyan king called... And anyways, Merneptah beats them, and they sod off back to the desert, and that's kind of the end of that. Could it be that this was the vanguard of what would become the destructive and unstoppable sea peoples, merely the first wave that broke on the shores of Egypt, and it would go on to roll over the lands of the Hittites, the Mykonians, and the Syrian cities? Maybe. Or it could just be another Libyan invasion of Egypt. They happen all of the time. I mean, they're right next to each other. The more useful inscription by far is that of Ramses. He tells us who the sea people were, including a couple of new groups. He tells us that they came from their islands, which gives us a bit of a clue as to their origins. And he also details how before getting to Egypt, they had destroyed the cities of Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant. Pretty good evidence, right? Well, yes it is, especially considering how little we have written about the sea peoples elsewhere. This inscription is genuinely amazing, but it still has problems. Like most pharaohs, Ramses has a bit of a habit of exaggerating his own achievements and taking credit for things that we know he didn't actually do. I mean, this is the same guy who straight up stole the victory monument from the tomb of another pharaoh to put it on his one. He is certainly not above exaggerating the threat that the sea peoples posed, really embellishing how destructive they were, only to make himself look better for being the one who had eventually stopped them. You gotta remember that these Egyptian inscriptions and funeral monuments aren't designed to record real accurate history. They're there as propaganda. Like, the real Ramses was definitely not that tall. How about the mention of the conspiracy in their islands? That surely lends a great deal of credibility to the idea that most of these people came from the islands of the Western Aegean, Sardinia, Sicily, maybe southern Italy, maybe a few of them from the islands of the Aegean. Well, not really. So apparently saying in their islands is something that seems very weird if you can read Egyptian. Which I can't, but Egyptologists can, and they tell me that the Egyptians didn't have a word for islands as we'd understand it. You know, as a bit of dry surrounded by a lot of wet. The word that Ramses uses here is rrrr. Yeah, the Egyptians didn't write vowels, you know, just to make my life easier. And apparently this translates more directly to land near water or coastal. So a better translation might be they made a conspiracy near the coast, which is far less helpful because it's the Mediterranean. It's all bloody coastal. Okay, that's enough of dealing with the Egyptians. Do we have any evidence from outside of Egypt? Surely if the sea peoples did, as Ramses claimed, steamroll through Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant before getting to the lands of the pharaoh, someone in this region would have written down something about them. Well, not really. Textual evidence for this era is really scant. And the only literary evidence we have for the sea peoples from outside of Egypt comes from the Syrian city of Ugarit. Ugarit is destroyed violently a few years before Ramses faces the sea people in Egypt. And before being destroyed, the people of the city send out an appeal for help against an enemy they were facing. Was this enemy that would probably go on to destroy the city the same sea peoples that attacked Ramses III a few years later? Possibly, and I think probably. But we can't know for sure because King Amurapi of Ugarit doesn't name any of the people he's under attack from. He just refers to them as enemy ships, which is supremely unhelpful. Okay, so there's a severe lack of textual evidence, not just for the sea peoples, but for the whole era in general. So do we have any material evidence? When there's no literary sources left and the historians are all baffled, we can usually trust in archaeologists to dig a clue out of the ground. Well, to start with, there's the sites of these cities themselves. All of these cities here show signs of violent destruction during this era. You know, signs that it was something other than just an earthquake. Arrowheads lying round, evidence of what were almost certainly man-made fires or attempts at evacuation. As we can see, there were a fair few cities that met violent ends in the years running up to the Sea People's invasion of Egypt, and it correlates fairly well with the list of destroyed cities that Ramses gives us. And then there's the archaeological discoveries of the Levant. This is where it gets really interesting. Just south of the city of Ugarit lies another city called Gabala, and a year or two after Ugarit is violently destroyed, Gabala suffers the same fate. But unlike Ugarit, Gabala is reoccupied a few years later. And the people who reoccupied this city, at least a few of which seem to have been newcomers to the area, had a material culture that was very reminiscent of the Aegean style. And the further south down the Levant you go, the more of this Aegean-style pottery you appear, or I should call it imitation Aegean-style pottery. That trade system that the Bronze Age world was so famous for has collapsed, remember. So they're not actually getting Aegean pottery, it's all locally manufactured, but it's done in the old-fashioned Mykonian style. This suggests two possibilities. Firstly, that the people of this area had been cut off from the international trade system that they were so used to being a part of, and foreign goods just simply didn't make it into the country anymore, so they react by making their own versions of it. And this might explain why the quality decreases ever so slightly. Imagine it like if the UK was cut off from the rest of the world and we didn't have access to Spanish, Italian or French wine anymore, so we tried to make our own out of blackberries or something like that. And it obviously wouldn't be as good, but we'd probably still bottle it and give it a French name anyway, because that's what people are used to. And the second possibility is that the material culture of these people looked very Mykonian because these people were Mykonians, migrants from the Aegean who had come down, settled in the Levant, and continued to practice their traditional crafts and trade. Maybe they didn't have access to the same quality of tools or the same level of organization that they were used to in Greece, or the same resources, and maybe that's why the quality isn't quite up to scratch. But wait, I hear you shout at your computers or phone screens. If these people were Mykonians, why did they only bring bits and pieces of their Greek culture to the Levant with them? Why did they not bring their Cyclopean palaces or their Linear B writing system? And what does any of this have to do with the Sea People? Well, to answer the first question, aspects of Mykonian culture like their palaces or their writing system were intimately tied with their political structure. The palaces existed as fortifications and as impressive centres of government from which a king could control a wide area. And the writing that the scribes used was never for diaries or thoughts or works of great literature. It was entirely to keep receipts and lists and records for that palace. And although the Mykonian people survived, their political structure did not. The great kings in their palaces ruled no longer. The age of the Wanaks was gone, and with them went the aspects of the Mykonian world that existed solely to prop the king up, things like the Cyclopean palaces. But people continued to make the essential goods that they always had done, things that would be manufactured and created whether a king ordered it to be done or not. And what does any of this have to do with the Sea People? Well, maybe the Mykonians were the Sea People. As we said earlier, there are two broad schools of thought regarding the origins of the Sea People, within the Bronze Age kingdom and outside of the Bronze Age kingdoms. Modern scholarship leans more towards the idea that much of the destruction that's attributed to the Sea Peoples was from within the spheres of influence of the great states. The fall of the Hittite Empire is usually accredited now to the Kashgar people from the north. The destruction of Ugarit and the cities of Syria was probably down to the Luka people of southern Anatolia. Just before Ugarit is destroyed, King Amurapi sends out an appeal for aid, saying that I can't fight off the enemy myself, my ships are all in the land of Luka, which suggests there was already hostility between these people. The Pelaset, who are thought to be the Pelasgians of the Aegean and Asia Minor, are usually equated nowadays with the biblical Philistines. They migrate southwards and they occupy the area that is now the Gaza Strip and southern Canaan, lands that were previously controlled by the Egyptian Empire. The Sherden or the Shadana are the ones most likely to not be from within the Bronze Age world. They look the most foreign and, like we said earlier, are almost certainly linked with the islands of the Western Mediterranean. But even that's not certain as their point of origin. This brings us back to our French friend, Maspero. I was probably a little harsh on him earlier. One of the very useful things he did is he was one of the first guys to draw a real link between the islands of the Aegean and the islands of the Western Mediterranean. This theory was taken much more seriously after 1885 when the Lemnos Stele was excavated, which found that there was actually a little bit of a link between the Lemnian language from the northern Aegean and the Etruscan language of northern Italy. This then morphs into the theory that the Shadana weren't from Sardinia originally, but from within the Bronze Age world. They became the Sea Peoples, played the role in our story that we're familiar with, and only afterwards migrated westwards to become the Nugaric people. The closer we look at the Sea People, the more our perspective on them changes from unstoppable, destructive force that caused the end of the Bronze Age to desperate refugees and opportunists who were trying to carve out a way of life for themselves in a rapidly crumbling world. People like those who settled in the Levant, who, according to scholar Yasser Landau, who's written a fair bit on this era, happened fairly peacefully. He points out that there's a lack of evidence for widespread destruction, and the intermingling of Aegean and Canaanite cultures suggests that this was a largely bloodless integration. And this leads us to the most important question to ask of the Sea Peoples when thinking about their role in the Bronze Age collapse. Are they causational or are they symptomatic? If we start looking at them the way we are, as being refugees and opportunists, why are they desperate? If they're migrators, why are they migrating? And most importantly, why could none of the immensely powerful empires of the late Bronze Age stop them? And it's because of this that most scholars nowadays incorporate the Sea Peoples into other theories of collapse. Even Nancy Sanders, who is a real authority on the subject and whose work was incredibly influential in bringing the study of the Sea Peoples to the forefront of historical discussion, can only really find a place for them as the dealers of the death blow to an already crippled Bronze Age world. If it was hunger that drove these large numbers of people to try and migrate, then our real culprit for the Bronze Age would surely be that famine. Or maybe it was their piracy that interrupted the trade system that the Bronze Age world was so dependent on that caused the real collapse. But even then, that just makes them a part of the systems collapse theory, something that we'll get to in more detail in a later video. The main thing to consider if we want to give the Sea Peoples a major role in this story, and they do seem to play a fairly major role, is why they couldn't be stopped. Why is it that these peripheral people, who had always been dominated by the larger empires on their borders, and could be little more than a nuisance to the great states for hundreds of years, were suddenly capable of bringing down the most powerful empires the world had ever seen in a matter of decades? Well, that's what we'll get into in the next video. Thanks for watching. You know, this whole Sea Peoples episode really does give the impression that H.P. Lovecraft was hired to write part of the epic cycle.
Which bit?
Oh, the Odyssey, probably. Giant vagina monsters are very much his speed, you know what I mean?
So you've been reading Lovecraft?
Oh yeah, he's pretty good. Very, very racist, you know, even by the standards of his day. Somehow more problematic than the literature I've been reading, which is 3,000 years old and more, so that's fascinating. You want to watch Troy?
Haven't seen it. Any good?
No, it's rubbish. You want to watch it?
Yeah.
Cool.